In the criminal justice system, wrongfully convicted offenses are considered especially heinous. In Canada, the dedicated lawyers who investigate these miscarriages of justice are members of an elite squad known as the Innocence Canada Unit. These are their stories.
Kyle Unger was 19 years old when he found himself in the middle of a murder case near his hometown of Roselle, Manitoba. He was wrongfully convicted for the rape and murder of his former classmate, 16-year-old Brigitte Grenier. On the night of Friday, June 22, 1990, Kyle Unger attended the Woodstick Rock Music Festival, which took place at a ski resort just outside of his hometown of Roselle, Manitoba. Also in attendance was 16-year-old Brigitte Grenier, a high school classmate of Kyle's, and 17-year-old Timothy Houlihan. All three young people had attended the festival separately with unrelated group of friends. Neither Kyle nor Brigitte were friends with Timothy Houlihan. Between the hours of midnight and 1:30 a.m., Brigitte was seen interacting with Timothy Houlihan. They were seen dancing, kissing, and fondling one another. After dancing together for a majority of the night, Grenier and Houlihan were seen leaving the main area of the festival and made their way to a secluded, wooded area of the ski resort. Timothy was not seen again until approximately 4 a.m. Around the same time, Unger returned from the washroom and told his friend he had seen Brigitte, quote, going at it with some guy, unquote. He parted ways with his friend at around 2 and 2:30 after declaring to his friend he was seeking out female company. Upon his return, Timothy was covered in mud and had scratches with blood on his face. He claimed his injuries were from an unknown male who had attacked him in the forest. He had claimed that the reason for his long absence was because he had passed out in the midst of the attack. Despite being allegedly beat to the point of unconsciousness, he continued his festivities with friends until the early hours of the morning. Before leaving the festival, Timothy and a friend had stopped to set fire to contents of a barrel near the entrance of the ski area. On June 23, 1990, Brigitte Grenier's half-naked body was found lying in a nearby creek that ran through the ski resort's wooded area. She had suffered through a heinous beating, which included being strangled, bitten, mutilated, struck numerous times in the head, and brutally sexually assaulted. The police had said that this was one of the most horrifying slayings in Manitoba history. The small town of Roselle was distraught and panic ensued, which led to immense pressure on the police to find out who committed this terrifying murder. The start of Unger's wrongful conviction began with the police investigation and progressed within the various levels of the criminal justice system. The investigation began almost immediately, and it didn't take long for them to find witnesses and eventually suspects, considering only 400 guests attended the festival. After the murder, the police interviewed Timothy Houlihan twice. During the first interview on June 25, 1990, they noticed that Timothy had visible markings on his face and hands, but since Timothy was a youth and did not have his parents present during the interview, the RCMP was unable to take down a statement. On June 27, 1990, Timothy had given the first of his two formal statements. In the first statement, he admitted to having consensual sex with Brigitte and claimed that an unknown male had left him unconscious after attacking him. In Timothy's second statement to the police, he had falsely implicated Kyle Unger into Brigitte's murder. In his statement, he provided police with a detailed description of the murder that was consistent with what they had initially thought. Timothy claimed that Kyle was the one who had savagely beat Brigitte and had convinced him to attack her as well. Timothy claimed that he assisted Kyle in moving her body because he feared for his life and was under duress at the time. In an interview, Kyle Unger states, quote, "Though I didn't know Timothy or Brigitte personally, Timothy's statement played a large role in why I was wrongfully convicted. It gave the RCMP reason to conduct an investigation with tunnel vision and target me. Their objectives seemed to get me to confess. It is important to note that the police deliberately implicated Kyle Unger into Timothy Houlihan's statement, and that when he was asked to describe Unger, he provided a description that was different than the description he gave of the attacker. The information was ignored by police. The police believed that two men committed the murder, and thus, on June 29, 1990, they arrested both 19-year-old Kyle Unger and 17-year-old Timothy Houlihan. Both were charged with first-degree murder. In this case, as well as many others, a contributing factor was tunnel vision, where police become willfully blind despite contradictory evidence. The tunnel vision was enhanced by community outrage and the pressures on the police to convict. In addition to Timothy's statement, the lack of reliable forensic evidence played a large role in Kyle Unger's wrongful conviction. In Timothy's case, there were several pieces of forensic evidence that tied him to the crime. This includes blood on his shoes that were consistent with the victim's. Also, the pubic hair found on Brigitte's sock was consistent with Timothy's pubic hair. In Kyle Unger's case, the forensic evidence was limited and not reliable. The only evidence that they had on Unger was a single piece of hair that was found on Brigitte's sweater. That piece of hair was supposedly consistent with a sample of hair from Unger's scalp that he had willingly given to the police. It is important to note that the hair that was taken from Unger was prior to the development of DNA technology, and although hair microscopy was once seen as a reliable forensic technique, it is now under scrutiny. This is because hair microscopy as an appropriate scientific technique is quite questionable. To further reinforce Unger's innocence, it is important to note that the bite mark found on the victim's body was not consistent with that of Unger's. A bite mark expert had reaffirmed this notion in Unger's preliminary hearing in court. This is one of the fundamental reasons why Kyle's charge had initially been stayed during the preliminary hearing. A jailhouse informant is an inmate, usually awaiting trial or sentencing, who claims to have been the recipient of an admission of guilt made by another prisoner awaiting trial, and who agrees to testify against that prisoner in a court of law, usually in exchange for some benefit. In Unger's case, the RCMP was motivated to get solid evidence against him, considering there was limited forensic evidence against him. An admission of guilt was therefore necessary for them to convict him. The RCMP interviewed close to 20 inmates in the hopes of finding someone who could testify against him. Their aim was to get someone to claim that Kyle had confessed to them about his involvement in Brigitte's murder. In the end, they only found 5 willing inmates and only one of them was called up during the trial. The prosecutor called up the jailhouse informant who went by the name of Jeffrey Cohen. In his testimony, Cohen had claimed that Unger shared a cell with him while he was in pretrial custody. He also claimed that Unger had admitted to the murder of Brigitte, saying, quote, "I killed her and got away with it," unquote. During the trial, the defense was able to prove that following the stay of proceedings, Kyle was released from the courthouse and never went back to the remand center. This meant that Jeffrey Cohen's statement was a lie. Jeffrey Cohen then admitted to lying on the stand. Approximately 15% of all wrongful convictions have involved a jailhouse informant. This is why the use of jailhouse informants is highly questionable. Oftentimes, informants are motivated to make confessions because they are incentivized. This becomes problematic because these incentives are not made public to the jury, and therefore their testimony appears to be legitimate.
Rats or fakes or whatever you want to call them are exceptionally unreliable. I guarantee you I can bring you people who will say you've murdered somebody and you confess to them.
The Mr. Big technique, also known as the Canadian technique, is a covert investigation procedure used by undercover police to elicit confessions from suspects in cases, usually involving murder. Police officers create a fictitious criminal organization and then seduce the suspect into joining it. Before officially joining, the target must have a meeting with the leader known as Mr. Big. In cases involving a Mr. Big sting, the RCMP report a 95% conviction rate. On June 13, 1991, the Mr. Big sting started in Kyle Unger's case. 2 undercover cops staged a breakdown of their car outside of Kyle's home in rural Manitoba. The primary undercover officer, Larry Tremblay, befriended Kyle and was tasked with conveying to him that there was an opportunity available to become involved in the criminal organization. On 4 separate occasions in the first week of the operation, Kyle told his new friend that he had been wrongfully imprisoned for murder. At no point did Tremblay request clarification regarding Kyle's declarations of innocence. In this specific Mr. Big sting operation, the role of Mr. Big was given to Corporal Larry Forbes. His first meeting with Kyle was on June 22, 1991. In order to please the boss, Kyle had lied and told him that he committed the murder of 16-year-old Brigitte Grenier. While Kyle did make a confession, it was evident that the confession was not truthful. In future conversations, Kyle made contradicting statements regarding details of the murder. Kyle was lured by the fact that he had a trusted position in a criminal organization, and the amount of money that came from the organization was enticing to Unger. It was a mistake, in that the confession that Kyle made was an absolute lie. It is not uncommon for individuals to make false claims during Mr. Big stings. In Kyle's case, the promise of money, status, and friendship were enticing to him, and he therefore confessed to the crime. In the eyes of the jury, the confession is seen as legitimate and reliable. The Innocent Project has found that in approximately 25% of DNA-exonerated cases, innocent defendants have made incriminating statements or delivered explicit confessions. In the case of Kyle Unger, his statement was seen as a key factor for his wrongful conviction. George Dangerfield was a Manitoba prosecutor who was responsible for the wrongful conviction of 4 Canadians. Their names are Thomas Sofanow, Frank Ostrowski, James Driscoll, and Kyle Unger. Dangerfield was once viewed as a powerful lawyer who often took on and won difficult cases. It came to light that George Dangerfield called disreputable witnesses to the stand, failed to disclose deals made with informants, knowingly allowed witnesses to commit perjury, and failed to disclose evidence. All of these factors, and more, contributed to a miscarriage of justice as it does not entail a fair trial. Needless to say, George Dangerfield was the Crown prosecutor in Kyle Unger's case. Kyle maintained his innocence throughout his 14 years in prison. He described his life in prison as a life of violence, blood, and death. A turning point in Kyle Unger's case came in April of 2003 when DNA results from James Driscoll's case questioned hair microscopy evidence. Once the evidence from Driscoll's case came out, the government of Manitoba set up a forensic review committee to review other cases where hair microscopy was used. The aim of this was to provide a new perspective on the validity of previous hair microscopy evidence. In 2004, the committee reviewed Kyle Unger's conviction. They tested the single hair that was found on Brigitte's sweater that, at the time, was believed to belong to Kyle. However, DNA analysis scientifically proved that the strand of hair did not, in fact, belong to Kyle Unger. Without this important piece of evidence, the Crown's case was substantially weakened, as the only evidence remaining was the unreliable, illegitimate Mr. Big confession. Unger was then granted bail, pending the minister's decision. This was his first taste of freedom in 14 years. The federal Minister of Justice ordered a new trial, and 4 years later, Unger's name was finally cleared. On October 23, 2009, Manitoba Deputy Attorney General formally withdrew the charges against Unger and asked that he formally be acquitted. Even with the acquittal, Kyle faced many challenges after his release. It was found that there would be no public inquiry into his wrongful conviction, and he would receive no compensation for his time spent in prison.
What is this moment like for you right now?
First day of the rest of my life, a new beginning.
Okay. You guys okay? Careful. Bye.